Tonight on Nation to Nation, in the line of fire, journalists, protests, and the police. Is it possible to get too close to a story?
We're living in a time where journalists are being arrested at a higher rate than we've ever seen. And one attack on one journalist is an attack on us all.
In the season finale, Nation to Nation is bringing together journalists who've covered protests in Ferguson, Standing Rock, and Muskrat Falls.
Are you speechless? You're under arrest.
We also speak with the father of a demonstrator from the Standing Rock protest, whose arm was nearly blown off during night of clashes on Backwater Bridge during the Dakota Access Pipeline protests. From Ferguson to North Dakota to Labrador, we've seen an uptick of intense protests lately. And despite the penetration of social media allowing anyone to broadcast to the world, journalists still play a key role in explaining events that shake our continent. And this puts them at risk of getting arrested for doing their jobs. We've convened a media panel to discuss this. Joining me now is Jenni Monet in Brooklyn, New York. Desmond Cole is in Toronto, and Justin Brake is in Bay of Islands, Newfoundland. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
All right, so we're going to talk today about covering protests, journalists facing chaos, how the police deal with journalists, and whether there's such a thing as getting too close. I guess to start this off, so our viewers know each of your experience, I want you guys to tell me a little bit about the one moment that stands out in part of your recent coverage. I want to start with you, Jenny. You covered the No Dapel movement in North Dakota, the Oseti-Sakowin camp, Standing Rock's fight against the Dakota Access Pipeline. What is one moment from your coverage of that situation that stands out for you?
Yeah, I think what the biggest takeaway is for me and those who know the work that I was doing out at Standing Rock for the 6 consecutive months of my covering the protests and the demonstrations is that I was arrested on February 1st. And at the time, I was the only credentialed journalist on the scene covering a demonstration, an action just like any other that I had over the months-long movement to stop the Dakota Access Pipeline. And I was compliant with every one of the police officers' orders to show my press credentials, move behind police lines when asked, and then when asked to leave, I did, and I was still arrested. And charges are still pending against me. I at once faced criminal trespassing and engaging in a riot, which could result in jail time. And Morton County is trying to make plea bargains with myself, but other journalists as well who've been arrested, other protesters, water protectors who've been arrested. And the notion is that for at least my situation, that this plea bargain would have asked me to plead guilty in a sense to, a non-compliance of a government function is what they want to reduce the charges down to, in a year probation. And the reality is that I was compliant and I was there doing my job just like the police were there doing their job. And, this is an issue of press freedom, but it's also one where I feel like I was potentially racially targeted because I am a Native American woman who is also a journalist who happens to be covering an indigenous-led movement. And, it just brings up a lot of really interesting topics for conversation in this time right now.
Desmond, you covered Ferguson. I just want to know a little bit about one thing that stands out for you from your coverage down there.
What I remember from landing in Ferguson right after the non-indictment against Darren Wilson. So Darren Wilson is the police officer in Ferguson, Missouri, who shot and killed Mike Brown, an 18-year-old teenager, black teenager. And so when they decided they were not going to charge this police officer, there was a lot of protesting in the streets, and I went down. And what became really clear to me was the way in which their perception of protesters committing violence gets distorted. So I watched as numerous times police officers who were on one side of a street, the main street in Ferguson where the police station is, would cross all the way over to the other side of the street and just select protesters that they were going to arrest. These protesters are not doing anything to the police. They're not threatening anyone else's safety. They were not, as far as I could see, breaking any laws. But they were just grabbed and then dragged back behind the police line. And if they tried to struggle, if they tried to resist, they were punched, they were kicked, they were pushed and thrown to the ground. And so I saw that firsthand and saw how different it was from the way that the mainstream media was describing how black people were protesting.
Justin, I want to go to you and about your memory or one specific incident that you recall clearly from your time covering the Muskrat Falls demonstrations last fall.
Right. So Inuit and settler Labradorians have been protesting at Muskrat Falls for a number of years now. But last fall, the protests, they ramped up in the lead up to what the Crown Corporation building the large-scale hydro dam there said would be the first phase of flooding, which would was projected to produce mercury, which would flow downstream into an area where thousands of people harvest traditional foods. It's part of their way of life, hunting and foraging and fishing in that area. So as that date approached, all efforts by protesters identifying as land protectors had failed over the years and in the weeks and months leading up to this date. So on October 16th of last year, a few dozen people broke through the front gate of the project and occupied the workers' camp, and I followed them. And that's the action that I took, the journalism that I did in following them. That's the action that I did that I'm facing charges for civilly and criminally for following them on to private property. But it was the moment that the land protectors entered the workers' camp there. There was this moment, there was a lot of anticipation leading up to it because they had to travel down a 10-kilometer road to get there. And there was, I guess, some anticipation. There was a narrative that had already been started to be created by the mainstream media and the Crown Corporation running the project, Nalcor, that there was a potentially dangerous situation unfolding. So the moment that the land protectors entered the workers' camp, I was able to be there and live stream on Facebook. And what we ended up seeing was land protectors identifying themselves, saying we're here only to protect our food and our way of life, and then workers actually embraced them and applauded them and supported them and even hugged them. And it kind of broke the narrative that was being constructed that this was a potentially dangerous situation and that land protectors may be violent.
Justin, you're now legally entangled. You're facing charges of mischief and disobeying a court injunction. When you were about to cross that line, did that thought run through your head, or did you not even think about it and you just went with the story at that time?
I went with the story. I mean, the only thing I thought about at that moment was, okay, press freedom is enshrined in Canada's Constitution, and clearly the public has a right to know, and this is a story of major public interest, so surely private corporate interests cannot trump that constitutional right of press freedom for the public's right to know. So I followed the story, and although other journalists didn't, because I did, we got to see that it was actually a really important story and one that had a major influence on public opinion.
Okay, well, I just want to redirect this question to Jenni. Jenni, how should a journalist navigate this threat of arrest when covering a volatile situation like this?
You know, I feel like I've been formally trained for this kind of coverage. You know, I've been a career journalist for 20 years now. I've been in lots of situations. I feel like I have learned from many of my past trial and errors. I don't know that there was anything else that I could have done different. As I mentioned, I felt like I was completely in compliance with the police. As a working journalist, as a career journalist, I make a concerted effort to have open dialogue and working relationships with all sides, because that's my job, is to cover all sides of the story. And that was no different than what I was doing in North Dakota at the state level, at the county level, at the very local level with the tribe, with the ranching community, with the water protectors. I maintained, and I took great pride in that, in maintaining this very solid working relationship with these groups. And that was the same for the police. And so when I was arrested and I told them that I was a journalist at that time, those charges should have been dropped at that point. Yet I was detained for 30 hours, treated differently than white women were in the jail. I don't know what other kind of training I could have endured at that time.
Desmond, down in Ferguson, journalists also got snared up by the police. Do you think these arrests are sort of incidental, or do you think sometimes journalists get targeted in these situations?
I think that journalists do get targeted often, and I think that the reason for that can often be that we may be about to capture something that the authorities don't want us to capture. So, for example, I can speak to an incident that I had here in Toronto recently. This was like last fall. I witnessed about 10 or 11 police officers on the sidewalk detaining one black man and making a really big production out of the fact that they were searching him in the middle of the street. And I took out my phone and began recording this. And I got the attention of a lot of the police officers, one of whom came up to me and on video tried to grab my camera out of my hand. That officer didn't want me to see and to document what he was doing to this innocent young black man on the street. So I think in a lot of cases we're being targeted because we might capture something that is damaging to the police, that reveals criminal or improper activity, and that does not help the police perpetuate their narrative that they're keeping everybody safe. Often they're keeping themselves safe, and I do think it's our job as journalists to expose that, but it can be dangerous.
Desmond, I want to go back to you and something that happened to you recently in terms of your relationship with the Toronto Star. You quit your column with the Star after management tried to, I guess, restrain or control your personal activism. I'm just wondering, what do you think was at the root of that?
I think at the root of that is white supremacy and anti-black racism. And I say that very specifically because I had a very specific experience at the Toronto Star which tells me that that's what happened and that that's what was influencing my departure. About a year ago, one of the most powerful people in the industry and in the publication itself, who's John Honderick, he's the chair of the board of Torstar, he took me out for lunch. Now you have to remember, at the time he took me out for lunch, I was a freelance columnist with the Toronto Star. I have never had a formal relationship with that newspaper, and I never signed anything. So he takes me out to lunch, and he begins talking to me about my content and about how he believed that I was writing about race issues too often. Now, that should have been the story in Canadian media. The fact that the most powerful person in my corporation took me out to try and influence my editorial positions. That's completely inappropriate, but it has everything to do with John Honderick being uncomfortable with me fighting against white supremacy and anti-black racism. So that was last year. So when this year I engaged in a public protest and the Star decided to haul me in to tell me that that was unacceptable, I recalled my conversation with John Honderick and thought, here he is again, uncomfortable with what it is that I'm doing. And I face this in my life everywhere. It's not just in journalism. So I'm not really surprised that people want us to tell our stories as black people as long as it doesn't change the system. They would like to profit off of my labor as a journalist. They would like to put me up as a black man and say, look how much we're supporting Desmond. But when I actually go out into the world and do the things that I'm writing about because I believe in them, well, the powerful people, including Honderick at the Toronto Star, their interests don't go that far.
Justin, I watched your live stream of your coverage of the occupation of the workers' camp, and when you left that workers' camp, people drummed you out. They drummed you out as you walked out. I'm just wondering, how did that make you feel as a journalist who's supposed to have some sort of, traditionally distance from the subjects you cover? How did you feel about that situation?
Right. Well, I mean, I was forced to leave the occupied Muskrat Falls camp. I was compelled by a Supreme Court of Newfoundland and Labrador injunction because of where I was physically standing and being in order to get that story. So, as far as I'm concerned, anybody who thinks that I got too close to the story, whether it was because of that ceremony that the land protectors had to send me off, some other reason. It was the Crown Corporation, Nalcor, who applied for the injunction from the Supreme Court and the RCMP, who have effectively made me a part of the story. I didn't do any harm as a journalist. All I did was bring the story to the people of the province and across Canada. And for that now I'm facing potential jail time, and even more seriously than that though is the risk that a precedent could be set in Canada if I'm convicted on any of the three charges, that journalists will not be able to cover these kinds of stories in the future. We can't step foot onto private property, which effectively means that corporations, governments, and law enforcement would be able to have absolute control over the flow of information going out of important spaces where things like Indigenous-led resistances are happening. They will be able to control the message if journalists don't go there. And so this is what we're at risk of losing, a really significant piece of press freedom in Canada.
Jenni, you're going to get the last word. How close is too close, and is there such a thing, given your own experience as a journalist covering the No DAPL movement?
At this day and age, how press freedom is under attack, the answer is no, in my opinion, because we're living in a time where journalists are being arrested at a higher rate than we've ever seen. And one attack on one journalist is an attack on us all. Without a free press, there is not a free democracy. So even if you're not a working career journalist, I think people from all communities should be paying very careful attention to the kind of media bashing that's happening, not just here in the United States, but also in Canada, where you have journalists who are under surveillance by the Canadian government. This is a real issue. And when we start whittling away the nobility of this profession, we start whittling away at the very virtues of our democracies and our open and free societies. And now is the time more than ever to get close to these issues and to stand up and say that that's not okay.
Okay, well, thank you, all you three, for joining us to talk about this. And this is an important topic, and I guess we'll see you guys out in the field.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ori.
Thank you so much.
When we return, we speak with Wayne Wilansky about the latest on his daughter Sophia, who was severely injured during last year's Dakota Access Pipeline protests in Standing Rock. I'm Jorge Barrera. This is NationToNation. In the early morning hours of November 21st, while demonstrators known as water protectors faced authorities on Backwater Bridge just north of the Standing Rock Reservation boundary, Sophia Wilansky suffered a devastating injury. Water protectors, local medical staff, and her father, Wayne Wilansky, said she was hit by a projectile fired by police that exploded on her arm. Since then, Sophia has undergone hours of surgery to save her arm. We now get an update on Sophia from her father and their planned legal action against the authorities. Joining me now is Wayne Wilansky. Mr. Wilansky, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
So I guess to start off, can you give us an update on how your daughter Sophia is doing?
I'd say she's doing very well mentally with the challenges that she's faced. Physically, the arm is pretty fairly useless. No real movement or feeling in the arm or the hand. So we're in a waiting period. We're hoping that the nerves that they've transplanted will become innervated and will begin to work sometime at the end of the year or perhaps early next year.
And how many more surgeries do you think she'll go through?
We really don't know. The surgeon described it as a trip to Saturn. It takes a really, really long time, and we know when we get there.
So there's another track to this. There's a legal track. I know that you initially had spoken about taking legal action against the authorities in North Dakota for what happened. Where is the status of that?
We have filed what's called a formal notice of claim. So basically under North Carolina law and many laws of many municipalities, you're required to file this formal document called a notice of claim. Putting them on notice that you intend to commence a lawsuit and what the elements of damage and the elements of the cause of the action are, and we have did that last week.
Okay, and in a nutshell, what is the cause? What is the elements of the damage? What is it you're seeking?
So we have two separate tracks. One is for a violation of a number of state laws, including excessive use of force. The other is a federal cause of action under Section 1983, which is for a breach of her constitutional rights. And additional to that, we've also filed a notice of claim for libel, slander, and defamation of character.
Okay, so some of these are going to be heard in federal court and some in state court?
Most the state courts, most of the state court actions will be pendant or attached to the federal court actions. So we expect that everything except the libel and slander and defamation will be heard in federal court.
There's also some evidence that you handed over personally to the FBI. They wanted to get her clothing that was from that night of the injury and also some shrapnel fragments. What is the status of that?
I call them every month and ask them if I can have the materials that they promised me back. They signed a written agreement with me that they would give me those materials. To date, they haven't given them to me so I could have them tested, although I have an expert waiting to test them. They keep saying that they're waiting for the FBI to formalize and finish their investigation, and that they promise that they will abide by their agreement, but they keep putting it off.
Has the FBI tried to interview your daughter or interview you or approach you guys about this?
As far as I know, the FBI has not only not approached me or my daughter, but none of the witnesses that saw what happened.
Okay, and there was also this flurry of activity around a grand jury. One of the water protectors got subpoenaed, and then the subpoena was dropped. Have you heard anything more about that?
We have not actually. You know, I'm regularly in touch with the U.S. Attorney's Office in North Dakota to try to get the shrapnel and the clothing, and of course they are not going to give me any kind of an update or let me know anything. So yeah, I don't know what's happening with it.
Okay, and what did you make of the authorities, the North Dakota authorities? And they've said it in some affidavits that have been filed as part of other claims going on, but they've basically claimed that this injury may have been caused by some sort of propane tank, some improvised explosive device in a propane tank. What do you make of their claims?
Well, I think originally their claim was to, cover themselves and to distract from all of the uproar over what happened. Since that time, they responded to my letter asking for a retraction by saying they never said she did anything. So it's interesting. They have immediately they kind of intimated that she was responsible for her own accident, and then they kind of backed away from that. And to date, they really haven't followed up with more.
Okay. Well, we're going to be watching closely to see how this action in court plays out, because I believe a lot of new information hopefully will surface about what was going on and what the authorities were doing. So we appreciate you coming on to give us an update on how things were going.
Thank you very much for having me.
All right. Thank you so much, sir.
Okay, bye-bye.
We'll be right back after the break. I'm Jorge Barrera. This is Nation and Nation. That's all the time we have for this, our last episode of the season. I want to thank our studio crew, John, Joseph, Jason, Mark, and Brendan, and our producer, Francine Compton, for all the work they do on the show. And also thanks to my co-host, Todd Lamran. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next season. Good night.